The emergency room at Westside General Hospital buzzed with activity on that sweltering Friday evening. The waiting area overflowed with patients, some moaning in pain while others scrolled mindlessly on their phones to distract themselves. The air smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, a combination all too familiar to Nurse Karen Matthews after 15 years on the job. Karen rubbed her temples, feeling the dull throb of a headache coming on. She'd been on her feet for nearly 10 hours straight, with 3 more to go before her shift ended. The ER had been short-staffed all week, and tonight was no exception. 2 nurses had called in sick, leaving Karen to handle twice her usual patient load. Her lunch break had consisted of a granola bar wolfed down between treating a construction worker with a nail through his palm and an elderly woman having a panic attack. "Matthews, we need beds for the incoming ambulances," Dr. Wilson shouted from across the nurses' station, not bothering to look up from the chart he was reviewing. "Clear out whoever you can." Karen nodded tiredly, scanning the status board. They were at 127% capacity, with 3 ambulances en route. Her eyes landed on bed 7, where she'd placed a boy about 30 minutes ago. She remembered thinking he didn't look that bad, just another kid with a fever whose family had overreacted. The boy's grandmother had been insistent when they arrived, claiming his fever had spiked to 103 and wouldn't respond to children's Tylenol. Karen had done a quick assessment, noting the child was alert and talking, though admittedly lethargic. She'd seen worse, much worse, and with the ER bursting at the seams, she needed to prioritize. She made her way to bed 7, where the boy, Elijah Williams, according to his chart, lay curled on his side. His grandmother sat beside him, gently stroking his forehead. The woman looked up as Karen approached, relief washing over her face. "Is the doctor coming soon? His fever feels even higher now," the grandmother said, worry creasing her brow. Karen glanced at the boy, making a split-second judgment. His dark skin made it harder to see if he was flushed, but he wasn't shivering or seizing. Not an emergency, she decided. Not compared to what was coming through those doors any minute. "We need this bed for critical patients coming in," Karen said, already reaching for the IV pole to disconnect it. "The doctor will see him in the waiting area. His vitals are stable." The grandmother stood up, confusion and alarm spreading across her face. "But he's burning up. We've been waiting for hours already." Karen felt irritation prickle along her spine. She didn't have time for this. "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but we have trauma cases arriving. Your grandson isn't critical. His name is Elijah," the grandmother said firmly. "And how do you know he's not critical if no doctor has seen him?" Karen continued unhooking the IV, barely glancing at the boy. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know what critical looks like." What she didn't say, what she barely acknowledged to herself, was that something about this family had rubbed her the wrong way from the moment they arrived. The grandmother had been too pushy, too demanding, acting like her grandson deserved special treatment when the waiting room was full of sick people. He can wait like everyone else, Karen thought, though a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that not everyone else had been moved from a bed back to the waiting area. The grandmother stood her ground. "He's only 8 years old and his fever was 103 at home. That's dangerous for a child." Karen checked her watch impatiently. "The ambulances will be here any minute. You need to move to the waiting area now. Can you at least check his temperature again?" the grandmother pleaded. "The triage nurse will recheck it in the waiting area," Karen replied dismissively, helping Elijah sit up. The boy's movements were sluggish, his eyes glassy with fever. An older white woman in bed 8 watched the scene unfold, her own IV dripping steadily for what appeared to be a minor allergic reaction. She'd arrived after Elijah, but had been quickly settled into a bed. She caught Karen's eye but quickly looked away when Karen noticed her staring. "I want to speak to the doctor," the grandmother insisted, her voice rising slightly as Karen helped Elijah to his feet. The boy swayed dangerously. "The doctor is busy with life-threatening cases," Karen snapped, her patience gone. "Now please move to the waiting area or I'll have to call security." The threat hung in the air between them. Several nearby patients and staff glanced over, the tension palpable. The grandmother's face hardened, but she gathered their belongings with shaking hands. "Come on, baby," she said softly to Elijah, supporting his weight as they shuffled toward the waiting area. "We'll just have to wait a little longer." As they walked away, Karen quickly stripped the bed and prepared it for the incoming traumas. She ignored the knot forming in her stomach, telling herself she was just doing her job, making tough decisions in an overwhelmed system. If the boy was really that sick, she reasoned, he would look worse. She'd seen plenty of worried families overreact about fevers. At the nurse's station, Lisa, a newer nurse, approached Karen with a furrowed brow. Was that really necessary? That kid looked pretty sick to me. We need the beds, Karen replied curtly. The waiting room is full of sick kids with anxious grandmothers. We can't admit them all. Lisa seemed unconvinced but didn't push the issue. Karen busied herself with preparing for the incoming ambulances, pushing down the discomfort she felt. She told herself it was just stress and fatigue making her irritable. Not anything to do with the Williams family specifically. But as she moved on to her next task, Karen couldn't completely silence the voice asking why she'd chosen that particular patient to move. There had been others who were less acute, others who had been there less time. She pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the immediate demands of the chaotic emergency room. In the waiting area, Elijah slumped against his grandmother, his breathing becoming more labored. Ms. Williams tried to flag down a staff member, but everyone rushed past, focused on the commotion of the arriving ambulances. She pulled Elijah closer, whispering prayers and promises that help would come soon, unaware that her grandson's condition was deteriorating far more rapidly than anyone had realized. The digital clock on the wall ticked forward, each minute stretching painfully as the grandmother watched her grandson's condition worsen, wondering why no one seemed to care about the small boy burning with fever in her arms. The waiting room of Westside General Hospital grew more crowded as the evening progressed. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow over the sea of anxious faces. In the corner, Ms. Williams cradled her grandson Elijah, whose condition was visibly worsening with each passing minute. "Grandma," Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible, "I feel funny." His eyes struggled to focus on her face. Ms. Williams pressed her weathered hand against his forehead and gasped. He was burning up, much hotter than before. The cheap plastic chair dug into her back as she shifted to better support his weight. "Help," she called out, her voice cracking. "Someone please help us." A few patients looked over sympathetically, but the staff behind the reception desk continued answering phones and typing on computers. Ms. Williams had already approached them twice in the 20 minutes since Nurse Karen had removed them from the ER bed. Each time she was told to wait their turn. "Just hang on, baby," she whispered to Elijah, fishing in her purse for her cell phone with her free hand. She needed to call her daughter, Elijah's mother, who was working a double shift across town. "We're going to get you help." 2 seats away, an older man with a bandaged hand noticed Elijah's deteriorating state. "That boy doesn't look right," he said loudly, trying to draw attention from the staff. "Hey, someone needs to check on this kid!" His outburst caused several more people to look their way. A woman with a toddler on her lap stood up and walked to the reception desk. "There's a little boy over there who looks really sick," she said to the receptionist. "I think he needs help right now." The receptionist, overwhelmed with paperwork and phone calls, barely looked up. "Everyone here is sick. That's why they're in the emergency room. We're seeing patients as quickly as we can." Meanwhile, inside the ER, Nurse Karen was assisting with the ambulance arrivals. One had brought in a car accident victim with relatively minor injuries, while another delivered an elderly man with chest pain who turned out to be suffering from indigestion, not a heart attack. The third ambulance had been diverted to another hospital at the last minute. Karen felt a twinge of regret as she realized they hadn't needed all 3 beds after all. She pushed the thought aside as she helped settle the car accident victim, a college student with a broken arm and facial lacerations. Dr. Patel, a young resident physician, was finishing up with a patient when he overheard 2 EMTs talking. "Did you see that kid in the waiting room?" one asked the other. "The one with his grandmother?" "Man, he looks septic to me." "Not our call," his partner replied. "We already handed off our patient." Dr. Patel's ears perked up. He was only 3 months into his residency, but he'd done a rotation in pediatrics and knew how quickly children could deteriorate. "Which patient are you talking about?" he asked the EMTs. "Black kid, maybe 7 or 8, with his grandmother. She was pretty upset, said they had been given a bed earlier but were sent back to the waiting room." Dr. Patel frowned. That didn't sound right. He glanced at the board of patients waiting to be seen but wasn't sure which name might correspond to the child the EMTs had mentioned. "I'm going to check it out," he decided, pulling off his gloves and heading toward the waiting room. Back in the waiting area, Elijah had begun to drift in and out of consciousness. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, and his skin felt hot enough to scald. Ms. Williams was now standing, holding him in her arms, her voice rising with panic as she pleaded with anyone who would listen. "My grandson is dying right in front of you all. Why won't anyone help him?" Several other patients had joined in, creating enough commotion that a security guard approached. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down," he began, but stopped short when he saw Elijah's condition. "We need a doctor here now." The security guard shouted, pressing his radio. "Medical emergency in the waiting area." Just then, Dr. Patel pushed through the double doors into the waiting room. He took one look at Elijah and rushed forward. "How long has he been like this?" he asked, immediately checking the boy's pulse. It was racing, thready under his fingertips. "It's been getting worse for the last half hour," Ms. Williams said, tears streaming down her face. "They put us in a bed when we first came in, but that nurse," she pointed toward the ER doors, "she made us come back out here. Said other patients needed the bed more." Dr. Patel lifted Elijah's eyelids, noting his pupil's sluggish response. "He's in septic shock. We need to move him inside immediately." He turned to the security guard. "Get me a gurney stat." The waiting room had gone quiet, all eyes on the small drama unfolding before them. The security guard ran to get a gurney while Dr. Patel continued his assessment, his young face grave with concern. "His temperature is 104.5, he announced after checking with a temporal thermometer. "And his oxygen saturation is dropping." He looked at Ms. Williams. "How long has he been sick?" "Started yesterday with what seemed like a cold," she replied, watching anxiously as Dr. Patel listened to Elijah's chest. "This morning he had a fever but was still playing a little. By afternoon he couldn't get off the couch. The fever kept climbing even with medicine." Dr. Patel nodded, his stethoscope picking up the telltale crackles of pneumonia in both lungs. "I think he has pneumonia that's progressed to sepsis, a dangerous infection in the bloodstream." The security guard returned with a gurney, and Dr. Patel gently lifted Elijah onto it. The boy didn't stir, his small chest rising and falling rapidly with each labored breath. "I'm taking him straight to the resuscitation room," Dr. Patel said, already moving toward the doors. "You can come with us, ma'am." As they rushed through the emergency department, they passed Nurse Karen, who was updating a chart at the nurses' station. She looked up, her pen freezing mid-sentence as she recognized Elijah, the boy she'd sent back to the waiting area half an hour earlier. The color drained from her face as she saw his condition. "I need a full sepsis workup and broad-spectrum antibiotics right now," Dr. Patel called out to the staff as they wheeled Elijah into the resuscitation room. "Get respiratory therapy in here for possible intubation." The ER burst into action. Nurses, including Lisa, who had questioned Karen earlier, rushed to establish IV lines and connect monitors. Elijah's heart rate displayed at 165 beats per minute, his blood pressure dangerously low. Karen stood frozen at the doorway, watching the team work. She'd seen this scenario play out countless times in her career, but never with a patient she had personally deemed not critical just 30 minutes before. Lisa caught her eye across the room, her gaze a mixture of accusation and disappointment. "He was in bed 7 earlier, wasn't he?" she asked quietly. Karen couldn't find her voice to respond. Inside the resuscitation room, Elijah's body suddenly went rigid, his back arching off the gurney. "He's seizing," someone shouted. "Push lorazepam." Dr. Wilson, the attending physician who had ordered Karen to clear beds earlier, rushed into the room and took command of the situation. "What's his history?" As Dr. Patel rapidly explained, Ms. Williams stood pressed against the wall, her hand over her mouth watching her grandson fight for his life. A social worker had appeared beside her, offering quiet support. Outside in the hallway, Karen felt like the floor was tilting beneath her feet. A simple fever, that's what she had dismissed it as. A simple fever in a boy who could wait his turn. She had made that judgment in seconds based on, what? The question hung in her mind as she watched the medical team fighting to save Elijah's life. What exactly had made her so certain he wasn't a priority? Why him and not the woman with the allergic reaction? Or the college student with the sprained ankle? As the brutal reality of her mistake began to sink in, Karen noticed the hospital administrator walking briskly toward the resuscitation room, her face set in grim lines. Behind her followed 2 patients from the waiting room, witnesses to what had happened. In that moment, Karen knew her actions would have consequences far beyond this one terrible night. And for the first time in her 15-year career, she found herself praying for a patient's recovery not just for the patient's sake, but for her own as well. The resuscitation room crackled with urgent energy as medical staff moved in a coordinated dance around Elijah's small body. The rhythmic beeping of monitors created an ominous soundtrack to their efforts. Dr. Patel barked orders while Dr. Wilson, the attending physician, oversaw the scene with practiced calm, though concern etched deep lines around his eyes. "He's post-ictal, but still critical," Dr. Wilson announced, referring to Elijah's state after the seizure. "Let's get a central line in and push another round of antibiotics. We need to get ahead of this infection." Ms. Williams stood in the corner, her body rigid with fear, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The social worker beside her, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Chen, gently explained what was happening. "They're giving him strong medicine for the infection and fluids to bring his blood pressure up," Mrs. Chen said softly. "The seizure stopped, which is good. They're working very hard for him." "This shouldn't have happened," Ms. Williams whispered, her voice trembling. "We were here. We were already inside in a bed. If they had just listened to me." In the hallway outside, Nurse Karen leaned against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. The hospital administrator, Dr. Gloria Reynolds, had arrived and was speaking with the security guard and several witnesses from the waiting room. Karen could catch snippets of their conversation. Phrases like "moved back to waiting area" and "deteriorated rapidly" cut through the background noise like shards of glass. Lisa approached Karen, her face a mix of professional concern and personal disappointment. "You need to document everything that happened," she said quietly. "Exactly as it occurred," Karen nodded numbly. "I didn't think. He didn't seem that sick." "You didn't look closely enough," Lisa replied, her voice low but firm. "And now everyone's asking why." The unspoken question hung between them. Would Karen have made the same call if Elijah had looked different? If his grandmother had been less assertive? The thought made Karen's stomach twist painfully. Inside the resuscitation room, Elijah's vital signs began to stabilize. The antibiotics were starting to work, fighting back against the bacterial invasion that had overwhelmed his small body. Dr. Patel wiped sweat from his brow as he checked the latest lab results. "White blood cell count is through the roof," he told Dr. Wilson. "Blood cultures are pending, but I'd bet my medical license this is pneumococcal sepsis secondary to lobar pneumonia. CT scan shows significant consolidation in both lungs." Dr. Wilson nodded gravely. "He's responding to the antibiotics, but he's not out of the woods. He'll need PICU admission and possibly ventilatory support." He turned to Ms. Williams, his manner softening. "Your grandson is very sick, but he's fighting hard. We're going to move him to our pediatric intensive care unit where he'll get specialized care." Ms. Williams wiped tears from her eyes. "Will he be okay? He's young and was healthy before this." "That works in his favor," Dr. Wilson answered honestly. "The next 24 hours will tell us more. The infection spread to his bloodstream, which is why he got so sick so quickly." "I told that nurse he was getting worse," Ms. Williams said, her voice gaining strength. "I begged her not to send us back to the waiting room. She wouldn't listen. She looked right through us." Dr. Wilson's expression darkened. "I'd like to hear more about that, but right now our priority is Elijah's care. I promise you this situation will be addressed." As if on cue, Dr. Reynolds appeared in the doorway. The hospital administrator took in the scene with experienced eyes before addressing Dr. Wilson. "How is the patient?" she asked, stabilizing. "Septic shock from community-acquired pneumonia. We caught it late, but he's responding to treatment." Dr. Reynolds nodded, then turned to Ms. Williams. "Ma'am, I understand there was an issue with your grandson's care earlier this evening. I'd like to speak with you about this once he's settled in the PICU." "There was more than an issue," Ms. Williams replied firmly. "There was negligence, and I want to know why." Karen, still standing in the hallway, felt her professional composure crumbling. 15 years of nursing had taught her to compartmentalize, to move on quickly from difficult situations, but this was different. This was a mistake she couldn't rationalize away. She had looked at a seriously ill child and made assumptions that could have cost him his life. The realization hit her with physical force. She had to sit down on a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Had she really become the kind of nurse who would dismiss a sick child because what? Because his grandmother was too demanding? Because she was tired and stressed? Or was it something more insidious? Biases she didn't want to acknowledge even to herself. The transport team arrived to move Elijah to the PICU. As they prepared him for the journey upstairs, Karen forced herself to approach Dr. Reynolds. "I'm the nurse who assessed Elijah earlier," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm the one who moved him back to the waiting area." Dr. Reynolds' expression hardened. "My office. 15 minutes, and bring your documentation." As Elijah was wheeled toward the elevator, Dr. Patel walking alongside and continuously monitoring his condition, Karen caught a glimpse of the boy's face. The oxygen mask covered most of it, but she could see his eyes were slightly open now, glazed with fever but fighting to stay conscious. His small hand rested in his grandmother's larger one. The elevator doors closed, taking Elijah to the next stage of his fight. Karen turned away feeling hollow inside. She had 15 minutes to gather her notes and her thoughts before facing Dr. Reynolds. 15 minutes to figure out how she would explain a decision that now seemed indefensible. In Dr. Reynolds' office, the tension was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Karen sat across from the administrator, her paperwork spread before her, including Elijah's initial assessment form. 2 chairs away sat Ms. Williams, who had only agreed to leave Elijah's side for this meeting after her daughter had arrived at the hospital to stay with him. "Let me understand the timeline," Dr. Reynolds began, her voice professionally neutral though her eyes were sharp. "Elijah Williams arrived at 6:15 p.m. with a fever of 103 degrees. Triage noted lethargy and rapid breathing. He was assigned to bed at 6:40 p.m. Is this correct?" Karen nodded. "Yes. And at 7:30 p.m. you made the decision to move him back to the waiting area." "On what clinical basis did you make this decision?" Karen swallowed hard. Looking at the documentation now, she could see all the warning signs she had missed or ignored. Elevated heart rate, respiratory rate at the upper limit of normal, the duration of fever, the lack of response to antipyretics. "We had ambulances coming in," she began, but the explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. I did a quick assessment and determined he could safely wait." "Without consulting a physician?" Dr. Reynolds pressed. "And despite these vital signs?" Ms. Williams leaned forward. "You didn't even touch him. You didn't take his temperature again. You just looked at him and decided." Karen felt sick. It was true. She hadn't retaken his vitals. Hadn't really looked at him at all. There were other patients who were moved to the waiting area tonight. Dr. Reynolds continued, consulting another document, all with less acute presentations than Elijah. "Can you explain why you specifically selected him to be moved?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Karen opened her mouth but found no words. "I have statements from 7 witnesses," Dr. Reynolds continued, including other patients, 2 EMTs and another nurse, all expressing concern about your interaction with the Williams family. One stated that you were dismissive and short with Ms. Williams, and that you threatened to call security when she advocated for her grandson. Karen felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I made a terrible mistake." "A mistake that nearly cost an 8-year-old boy his life," Ms. Williams said, her voice breaking. "My grandson could have died in that waiting room while you were treating people with far less serious conditions." "Why?" Dr. Reynolds asked simply. "I need to understand why this happened so we can make sure it never happens again." Karen stared at her hands. The truth was ugly, but it needed to be faced. "I was tired and stressed. The ER was overcrowded. I made a snap judgment based on what?" Ms. Williams pressed. "Based on biases I didn't even realize I was carrying," Karen finally admitted, looking up to meet Ms. Williams' gaze. "I saw a grandmother being assertive about her grandson's care, and instead of recognizing that as advocacy, I labeled it as difficult behavior. I didn't give Elijah the same careful assessment I would have given other patients. There's no excuse for that. None." The admission hung in the room like a physical presence. Dr. Reynolds made a note on her pad. "Nurse Matthews, you're suspended pending a full review of this incident. You'll be required to meet with HR tomorrow. Ms. Williams, the hospital will be conducting a thorough investigation, and I want to assure you that appropriate action will be taken." Ms. Williams nodded, then fixed Karen with a steady gaze. "I just want to know that when I bring my grandson or any other family member to this hospital, they'll receive the care they need without having to fight for it. Without having to prove they deserve it." Karen felt the full weight of those words. As a healthcare provider, she had sworn to do nowhere to treat all patients with equal care and compassion. Tonight she had failed that oath in the most fundamental way possible. "I am so sorry," she said, knowing the words were wholly inadequate. Ms. Williams stood up. "I need to get back to my grandson now. He's the only thing that matters." As she left the office, Karen remained seated, facing the consequences of actions that had revealed truths about herself she had never wanted to see. The road ahead would be difficult but necessary. For her, for Elijah, and for every patient who would come through those emergency room doors in the future. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Karen's apartment, casting stripes of light across her untouched cup of coffee. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elijah's face, feverish, struggling to breathe, his grandmother's desperate pleas echoing in her ears. The events of the previous night played on repeat in her mind, a horror movie she couldn't shut off. Her phone buzzed with another message from a coworker. She ignored it. Word had spread quickly through the hospital staff about what had happened. Some messages were supportive, others judgmental, but Karen couldn't bear to read any of them right now. She glanced at the clock. Her meeting with Human Resources was in 2 hours. She should shower, get dressed, try to look professional. Instead, she sat motionless, overwhelmed by the weight of her actions. A knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she found Lisa standing there, still in her scrubs from the night shift. "I thought you might want an update," Lisa said, her expression giving nothing away. Karen stepped back, allowing her colleague to enter. "How is he?" "Stable. Still in the PICU, but his fever's down and his blood pressure has normalized." Lisa sat on the edge of the couch. "They're saying he'll make a full recovery." The relief that flooded through Karen was so intense it made her dizzy. She sank into a chair. "Thank God." "It was close, Karen." Lisa's tone was gentle but firm. "If Dr. Patel hadn't gone to check the waiting room when he did..." "I know." Karen's voice cracked. "I can't stop thinking about it." "About what I did." Lisa studied her for a long moment. "The hospital's taking this seriously. There's talk about implementing new protocols, maybe even unconscious bias training for all staff." She paused. "People are choosing sides. Some are saying you're being scapegoated for systemic problems." Karen shook her head firmly. "No, I made the decision. I looked at that boy and his grandmother and made assumptions I had no right to make." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The worst part is I didn't even realize I was doing it." "That's the thing about bias," Lisa said quietly. "It works in the background, influencing decisions we think are objective." Karen looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. "I became a nurse to help people. All people. How did I let this happen?" Lisa didn't offer empty reassurances. "What matters now is what you do next." After Lisa left, Karen showered and dressed with mechanical precision. The hospital's HR offices were located in a separate building from the main facility, for which she was grateful. She couldn't face walking through the ER right now. Couldn't bear to see bed 7 where Elijah had lain before she made her fateful decision. The HR representative, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Phelps, met Karen in a small conference room. Also present were Dr. Reynolds and a union representative Karen had requested. "This is a preliminary meeting," Mrs. Phelps began, "to discuss the events of last night and the path forward. The incident is still under investigation, but given the seriousness of what occurred, immediate action was necessary." Karen nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Nurse Matthews, your personnel file shows 15 years of service with generally positive evaluations," Mrs. Phelps continued. "No previous disciplinary actions. Several commendations for exceptional care." She looked up from the file, which makes last night's lapse in judgment all the more concerning. Karen didn't attempt to defend herself. There was no defense. Dr. Reynolds spoke next, her tone measured. "We've taken statements from multiple witnesses. The picture they paint is troubling, to say the least. A critically ill child was removed from treatment and sent back to the waiting area, where his condition deteriorated dangerously. I'm responsible," Karen said simply. "Whatever happens next, I want that on record. This wasn't a system failure. It was my failure." The union representative shifted uncomfortably beside her but didn't interrupt. "Ms. Williams and her family would have grounds for legal action," Dr. Reynolds continued. "However, she has indicated that what she wants is accountability and change, not punishment. She's asked to meet with you." Under supervised conditions. Karen's head snapped up in surprise. She wants to meet with me, why? That's for her to explain if you agree. Karen swallowed hard. The thought of facing Ms. Williams again filled her with dread, but she nodded. Of course. Whenever she wants. Mrs. Phelps slid a document across the table. This is the terms of your suspension. 4 weeks unpaid. During this time, you'll be required to complete a comprehensive course on implicit bias in healthcare settings. You'll also meet weekly with a counselor specializing in healthcare ethics. At the end of the suspension period, there will be a review to determine if you can return to duty, possibly on probation. Karen signed without hesitation. The consequences seemed mild compared to what might have happened to Elijah. One more thing, Dr. Reynolds added. Ms. Williams has requested that you not be fired. Karen looked up in disbelief. She what? She said, and I quote, firing her doesn't solve the problem. The problem is bigger than one nurse. Dr. Reynolds studied Karen's face. She's right, you know. What happened with Elijah Williams isn't an isolated incident. It happens in hospitals across the country every day. Most cases just don't end with such a clear demonstration of the consequences. After the meeting, Karen found herself wandering the hospital grounds, unable to face going home to her empty apartment with nothing but her thoughts for company. She ended up in the small chapel, a non-denominational space of quiet reflection. It was empty except for a middle-aged man sitting in the back row, head bowed. Karen slipped into a seat near the front, closed her eyes, and for the first time since the incident, allowed herself to cry. The tears came silently at first, then in racking sobs that shook her entire body. Rough day? Karen turned to find the man from the back row standing in the aisle beside her. His kind eyes and clerical collar identified him as one of the hospital chaplains. You could say that, she managed, wiping her eyes. Mind if I sit? When she nodded, he lowered himself into the seat beside her. I'm Chaplain Thomas. Karen Matthews. She hesitated, then added, I'm a nurse. At least I was. Ah, he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're the nurse from the ER last night. Karen stiffened. News travels fast. It's a hospital, he said with a gentle smile. Gossip moves faster than sepsis. Despite everything, Karen found herself laughing, a short, broken sound. Then you know what I did. I know what happened, he corrected. I spent this morning with the Williams family in the PICU. Remarkable people. The grandmother especially. Karen fell silent, imagining Ms. Williams sitting vigil at Elijah's bedside, exhausted but refusing to leave. She told me something interesting, the chaplain continued. She said she's been bringing her family to this hospital for 40 years. Said she's seen changes, some for better, some for worse. But she's never given up hope that one day she'll walk through those doors and be seen as just another worried grandmother, not a difficult one. The words struck Karen like a physical blow. I don't know if I can face her. You can, Chaplain Thomas said simply. Because you have to, not just for her or for yourself, but because what happens next matters. What do you mean? I mean that moments like these, painful as they are, create openings for real change. Not just policy changes or new training programs, though those are important too, but the deep internal change that happens when we truly see ourselves clearly for the first time. Karen thought about this. I've always considered myself fair, unbiased, a good nurse. Most of us think of ourselves that way. The chaplain nodded. It's harder to face the possibility that we might be carrying prejudices we're not even aware of. How do I fix this? Karen asked, desperation edging her voice. How do I make sure I never make this kind of mistake again? Chaplain Thomas considered her question carefully. You start by listening. Really listening. To Ms. Williams. To other patients whose experiences might be different from yours. And most importantly, to that voice inside yourself that tried to warn you last night that something wasn't right about the decision you were making. They sat in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. The Williams family has agreed to meet with you tomorrow afternoon if you're ready. Karen took a deep breath. I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I'll be there. The next day, Karen arrived at the hospital 30 minutes early for the meeting with the Williams family. She sat in her car gathering courage, rehearsing what she might say, though no words seemed adequate for the harm she had caused. Eventually, she made her way to the small conference room where the meeting would take place. Dr. Reynolds was already there, along with Chaplain Thomas. They nodded in greeting but said nothing as Karen took a seat. her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it. When the door opened again, Karen stood up automatically. Ms. Williams entered first, followed by a younger woman who had to be Elijah's mother. The family resemblance was striking. Both women regarded Karen with unreadable expressions. "Thank you for coming," Dr. Reynolds began formally. "As we discussed, this meeting is an opportunity for open dialogue about what happened and how we move forward. Ms. Williams, would you like to start?" The older woman nodded, her dignified presence filling the room. She looked directly at Karen, her gaze unwavering. "I want to know why," she said simply. "Why my grandson? Why didn't you see how sick he was? I need to understand." In that moment, facing the grandmother whose pleas she had dismissed, Karen knew that only absolute honesty would do. Whatever consequences came from that honesty, she would accept them. She owed this family nothing less than the complete, unvarnished truth. Karen took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she met Ms. Williams' steady gaze. The conference room felt too small, too warm, the silence stretching between them like a living thing. "The truth is," Karen began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I made assumptions, terrible, unfounded assumptions that I didn't even realize I was making." She swallowed hard. "When you kept insisting that Elijah needed immediate care, I labeled you as difficult in my mind. Instead of seeing a grandmother fighting for her sick grandson, I saw someone demanding special treatment." Elijah's mother shifted in her seat, her expression hardening. But she remained silent. "The ER was busy, yes. We were short-staffed, yes. But those aren't excuses," Karen continued, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite the shame burning through her. "I've spent the last 2 days asking myself why him and not the other patients? And the answer is ugly but true. I looked at your grandson, at your family, and I made split-second judgments based on biases I didn't want to admit I had." "You mean because we're black?" Elijah's mother said bluntly. Karen felt tears threatening, but blinked them back. This wasn't about her feelings. "Yes?" And because Ms. Williams was being assertive in advocating for Elijah, I interpreted that as aggression instead of what it was, a grandmother's legitimate concern. Ms. Williams nodded slowly, as if Karen had confirmed something she already knew. "This isn't my first time experiencing this. Not even my 10th, but it's the first time anyone has actually admitted it." "How is Elijah doing?" Karen asked softly. "He's improving," Elijah's mother replied, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "They're moving him out of intensive care today. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery, no thanks to you." Karen accepted the deserved rebuke without defense. "I'm so sorry. Those words feel completely inadequate, but I am truly, deeply sorry." Chaplain Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Williams, you mentioned to me that you had something you wanted to share with Nurse Matthews about your experiences with the healthcare system." Ms. Williams straightened in her chair, smoothing her skirt with practiced hands. "I've been bringing my family to this hospital for 40 years. I had all my children here. I've seen a lot of changes. Some doctors and nurses see us, really see us. Others look right through us." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The first time I noticed the difference, I was bringing my oldest son in with a broken arm. The nurse kept asking if he was really in pain or just seeking attention. He was 7 years old with a bone poking through his skin." Karen winced at the story, but didn't interrupt. "Over the years, I learned how to advocate for my family. I learned to bring medical records, to use certain words, to dress a certain way when coming to the hospital. I learned to be firm but not too emotional, because if you show too much emotion, you get labeled as hysterical or aggressive." Ms. Williams' eyes never left Karen's face. "Do you know how exhausting that is? To be fighting for your child's care while also managing how medical staff perceive you?" "No," Karen admitted. "I can't imagine. When I brought Elijah in that night, I knew something was seriously wrong. A grandmother knows. But the minute you looked at us, I could tell you'd already decided we weren't a priority." Elijah's mother spoke up, her voice tight with restrained anger. "My son nearly died because of those assumptions. Do you understand that? If Dr. Patel hadn't checked on him when he did, we might be planning a funeral right now instead of sitting in this room." The stark reality of those words hung in the air between them. Karen felt physically ill at how close they had come to tragedy. "I didn't come here to punish you," Ms. Williams said after a moment. "I've seen enough punishment in my life. I came because I want things to change." Real change, not just apologies and diversity posters in the waiting room. Dr. Reynolds, who had been quietly observing, now leaned forward. That's why we're here. The hospital is committed to addressing what happened systemically, not just individually. We're implementing new protocols for reassessment of waiting room patients, unconscious bias training for all staff, and creating a patient advocacy program. Programs are good, Ms. Williams nodded, but change starts with people admitting there's a problem in the first place. Most times when something like this happens, everyone gets defensive, starts making excuses. Karen found her voice again. No excuses. What I did was wrong. Period. She hesitated, then continued. I became a nurse because I wanted to help people. All people. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I let biases cloud my judgment, and Elijah paid the price. I will carry that knowledge with me forever. What happens now? Elijah's mother asked Dr. Reynolds. She gets a slap on the wrist and goes back to treating patients the same way? I'm suspended for 4 weeks without pay, Karen answered before Dr. Reynolds could speak. I'll be completing intensive training on implicit bias and meeting with an ethics counselor. After that, if I'm allowed to return, I'll be on probation. She met Elijah's mother's gaze directly. But that's just the official response. Personally, I'm committed to doing the work to change. Not just for my sake, but for every patient who comes through those doors after Elijah. Chaplain Thomas smiled softly. Ms. Williams has actually made a suggestion that I think has merit if you're open to hearing it. All eyes turned to the older woman, who straightened her shoulders before speaking. There's a community health initiative I volunteer with. We work with families who are nervous about seeking medical care because of past negative experiences. Many avoid going to the hospital until it's an emergency, like we almost did with Elijah. She paused. They need healthcare providers who understand their concerns, who can help rebuild that trust. Once you've completed your training, I think you could contribute something valuable there. Karen stared at her in disbelief. You'd want me to work with you? After what happened? Not right away, Ms. Williams clarified. After you've done some learning. After you've shown you're serious about change. Sometimes the people who make the biggest mistakes end up becoming the strongest advocates, if they're willing to do the hard work of transformation. The offer hung in the air, unexpected and undeserved. Karen felt a spark of something she hadn't felt since the incident. Hope. I'd be honored, she said quietly, if you're willing to give me that chance. Elijah's mother looked skeptical but didn't object. My son wants to be a doctor someday. He's always been fascinated by medicine, by helping people. I don't want his experience in this hospital to change that dream. I don't want him to grow up believing the medical system wasn't built for people who look like him. May I ask how old Elijah is now? Karen asked. He turned 8 last month. 8, Karen repeated softly. So young to learn such a hard lesson about the world. Black children learn those lessons early, Ms. Williams said, not unkindly, but matter-of-factly. The question is whether adults like you are willing to learn them too. The meeting continued for another hour, moving from the painful recounting of what happened to more practical discussions about changes at both personal and institutional levels. By the end, no miracle transformation had occurred. Trust, once broken, could not be instantly repaired, but a fragile bridge had begun to form. 3 days later, Karen stood outside Elijah's hospital room, a children's book clutched in her hand. She had called ahead to make sure both Ms. Williams and Elijah's mother approved of her visit. Dr. Reynolds accompanied her, both as support and supervision. Are you ready? The administrator asked. Karen nodded, though her heart pounded. She had faced the family's anger and pain in the conference room, but facing Elijah himself felt infinitely more daunting. They entered to find Elijah sitting up in bed, looking remarkably better than the last time Karen had seen him. His skin had regained its healthy glow, and though he still had an IV line, the multiple monitors and oxygen support were gone. He was focused on a tablet game but looked up when they entered. Elijah, this is Nurse Matthews, his grandmother explained gently. She wanted to come say hello. The boy studied Karen with curious eyes that seemed older than his 8 years. You're the nurse from that night? Karen nodded, her throat tight. I am. I brought you a book if that's okay. She held out the gift awkwardly. Elijah accepted it with a small smile. I like reading. I heard you want to be a doctor someday, Karen said, finding her voice. A pediatrician, he confirmed. so I can help kids like me. You'll be an amazing doctor, Karen told him sincerely. The medical world needs more doctors like you will be. Ms. Williams watched this exchange with thoughtful eyes. Elijah, Nurse Matthews made a mistake when you were sick. A big mistake, but she's trying to learn from it and do better. The boy considered this with surprising maturity. My teacher says mistakes are how we learn if we pay attention to them. Your teacher is very wise, Karen said, her voice wavering slightly. I'm paying very close attention to this one. Elijah returned to his game, the brief interaction complete from his perspective. The adults moved toward the door to continue their conversation in the hallway. He doesn't know how sick he was, Elijah's mother said quietly. He doesn't understand how close. She didn't finish the sentence. But we do, Ms. Williams added, looking meaningfully at Karen. And that knowledge comes with responsibility. Karen nodded, understanding the weight of those words. I won't forget, and I won't stop working to be better, to do better. As she left the hospital that day, Karen felt the enormity of the journey ahead. There would be hard days of self-examination, of confronting uncomfortable truths about herself and the system she worked in. The path to rebuilding trust with the Williams family, with her colleagues, with herself would be long and sometimes painful. But watching Elijah sitting up in bed, already healing, already dreaming of his future as a doctor, Karen knew this was work worth doing. One nurse, one patient, one family at a time. That was how real change would happen. Not through grand gestures or policy statements alone, but through the daily, deliberate choice to see each person who came through those hospital doors as exactly what they were, a human being deserving of care, compassion, and respect. For the first time since that terrible night, Karen felt something inside her healing too. Not absolution, she hadn't earned that yet, but purpose. A clear-eyed understanding of the harm that had been done, and a fierce commitment to ensuring it never happened again.